Among the big-name game consoles, Microsoft's Xbox brand has been around the least amount of time. Despite not making game consoles in the 80s and 90s, Microsoft has still come a very long way. And the story of Microsoft's hardware is a very interesting one. With that in mind, gameranx is happy to bring you the evolution of Xbox hardware. All the way back in 1998, Microsoft had just finished collaborating with Sega to create the Dreamcast. Microsoft provided a Windows CE development environment and the DirectX API to make development on the Dreamcast easier than ever before. But just as the Nintendo PlayStation brought Sony a heavy hitter into the console market in a completely unintended fashion, Sega's Dreamcast did the exact same thing with Microsoft. Almost immediately after finished working on Dreamcast, 4 engineers from Microsoft's DirectX team, which included Seamus Blackley, Kevin Bacchus, and Ted Hayes under the direction of team leader Otto Burks, quite simply got bit by the game console bug. Whether it was working on the Dreamcast and seeing how games can be fun on a console that did it, or even purely business motives, I don't know, the Sony PlayStation 2 was luring developers away from Windows, and was kind of a threat. And being all these people were on the DirectX team, which essentially is the thing that powers most of Windows gaming, one might understand why they might want people not to be lured away from the computer, or at least DirectX Technologies. We all need that job security. So they all thought it would be good if Microsoft made a game console. So how do you do that when you don't have a console engineering team? Well, believe it or not, these 4 actually disassembled some Dell laptop computers and reassembled them together to create their prototype. But I sincerely doubt this small team had any idea that this Frankenstein's monster of a console was about to take the world by storm. This team of 4 approached Ed Fries, who was the leader of Microsoft's game publishing division at the time, and showed him their vision for a DirectX box. Now, think about that. This was a game console 4 people made out of mass market components, without authorization, without asking anyone, probably not on company time, given it was a private project to start with, and really, if you consider other similar projects to that in other companies, by all accounts really shouldn't have been made. But Ed Fries was not a dummy. He saw some serious potential and said, let's do this. During development, the DirectX box team decided that they should shorten the name to Xbox. The marketing department thought that name was really stupid. And when I say that, I don't mean I'm exaggerating that. I mean during focus testing, they put the Xbox name on the list of possible names, literally to prove a point. Out of spite, they kept that name on there to try to tell the development team that this was a bad name. It was them that looked pretty stupid in the end when the focus testing revealed that consumers much preferred the name Xbox to literally anything else they came up with, which probably resulted in a great big laugh from the 4 original team members especially. So after a great many delays, on November 15th, 2001, the Microsoft Xbox debuted on the consumer market. The first Xbox ran on a custom version of the Intel Pentium 3 Coppermine-based processor, running at 733 MHz. It ran on a shared graphics memory subsystem with 64 megabytes of DDR SD RAM at 200 MHz, and had a GPU that Microsoft co-developed with NVIDIA called the NV2A 233 MHz ASIC chip. It had an old school hard drive in it, which came in either 8 or 10 gigabytes, pretty big for the time actually, that ran at 5400 RPMs. It ran on the FAT-X file system, which you actually don't really typically see a lot of, then or now. It did take 32 megabyte memory cards, but you didn't have to because it could save your games to the hard drive, and unless you wanted to take a save to a friend's house or something, I can't really see why you would have used it. Although the times were very different, and none of us really thought about this as, hey, that's probably one of the best reasons to have a hard drive. Where the PlayStation 2 needed a network adapter in order to plug into even Ethernet, Xbox had it built in, which considering everything at the time was pretty amazing, and is actually one of the biggest reasons why the Xbox console became so big. You know how the very first Halo was the quote-unquote killer app for the first Xbox. Part of the reason for that was because you could put a bunch of Xboxes on a LAN and have much larger scale multiplayer matches than previous consoles were capable of, like the Nintendo 64 with its 4-player split-screen multiplayer on anything that had it. This not only created a level of fairness that really wasn't present in a split-screen situation. Nobody else could see what you were doing at the time, if indeed you were on a separate TV that nobody else could see, but it also created the console LAN party. Something that PC gamers did finally showed itself in console gaming, and many people believe that this was kind of the reason why the Xbox became successful, because it united a lot of people that really liked console games together for parties, for get-togethers, and just created an environment that allowed people to go, wow, I really like Xbox. This is great. I haven't done anything like this before with a game console. It actually had 4 USB ports for controllers, so if you really wanted to, you could play 4-player split screen, and believe me, I did. But man, LAN parties. If that's not a direct example of how gaming hardware progressed exactly what gaming is, I don't know what to give you. On top of that, the Xbox could run at a resolution up to 1080i. I'm not saying every single game ran in HD or anything, because most of them didn't, but seriously, Xbox was such a big jump for so many things. And even if you didn't really love the kinds of games that came out on Xbox, which were primarily shooters and kind of Western style video games, and a lot of video games was based around Japanese stuff at the time, look how that changed, there was some experiences that you just could not get on another game console, and that's why the Xbox thrived. While the first Xbox was kind of a success for a very specific set of reasons, probably the biggest of which being Halo, as we talked about, it was also only a warm-up. As time went by and hardware got better, obviously the next generation of consoles was going to follow. In about 2003, Microsoft started working on what was going to become the Xbox 360. The thing that's cool about the Xbox 360 is where the Xbox kind of came out of nowhere and was a surprise hit in its own right. The Xbox 360 was a calculated and very planned out, intelligent launch process. One fairly interesting thing about it though, where the original Xbox was created to keep people on the Windows platform for development, the Xbox 360 ran on PowerPC architecture, which is what Apple's Power Mac G5 ran on, and believe it or not, some of the development kits actually were Power Mac G5 hardware. Another little tidbit was the Xenon processor that was developed by both IBM and Microsoft in tandem was really a slightly modified version of the Cell processor that IBM developed in tandem with Sony. If you think about this kind of stuff, Microsoft was super sneaky about the Xbox 360 and was really playing a cutthroat game from the start, probably knowing what they had with the Xbox brand could be expanded to something that really just took over video games. But in order to achieve something like that, Microsoft needed a console that was going to be a definite difference, not only from Xbox, but also from the next PlayStation. So, as I said, with the Xenon processor, the bomb that Microsoft dropped on the gaming community as well as Sony is a triple-core 64-bit PowerPC processor designed by IBM. Each of the 3 cores is clocked at 3.2 GHz and is capable of a lot of simultaneous multi-threading. Where the CPU was a processor developed by IBM called the Xenon, the GPU was developed by ATI and called Xenos. Now the Xenos is probably the big reason why the Xbox was easier to develop for than the PlayStation 3, and therefore probably a big reason why the Xbox 360 was able to attract a lot of developers that were originally planning just exclusive PlayStation 3 titles. And well, it was a 500 MHz GPU, which is pretty comparable to the PlayStation 3's GPU. The big thing was it was compatible with a version of the DirectX 9.0C API. Now, if you don't know what that means, the API is essentially the language that you use to talk to the hardware. While Sony's was completely proprietary, the Xbox 360 using a compatible version of DirectX meant almost every PC developer was also an Xbox developer, which again was kind of the same strategy that they used for the original Xbox. Now, if you compare it to the reality synthesizer in the PlayStation 3, you'll see a lot of the numbers are almost the same. So what we were just talking about is probably more important than the actual hardware specifications on the GPU itself, and that's exactly why support for DirectX being integrated into the chip is far more important than any specifications you can imagine. The console has 512 megabytes of GDDR3 RAM clocked at 700 MHz, which essentially ran at 1.4 GHz on a 128-bit bus. The Xbox 360 shares this memory between the CPU and the GPU because it uses unified memory architecture. Now, the original configuration of the system came with a 20GB hard drive, which was actually very easy to swap out because it was kind of in a little case that had a weird plug. It was just a SATA hard drive, which is very standard, but at the same time, the custom enclosure made it seem like it was kind of its own device. The thing that was neat about that was that you could easily swap out the hard drive, or just bring a hard drive along with you and take all of your save games and everything to another console. We didn't really talk that much about the original Xbox's controller because it was terrible, but the Xbox 360 thought, you know what, let's not have another terrible controller. And so they created basically the best controller for video games since the Sega Genesis controller, and also made it so that you could connect wirelessly using any proprietary or licensed controller, which was very cool. You could turn the damn console on from the controller. One of the cool things these advances enabled, digital media distribution. Another piece of hardware introduced this generation was the Xbox Kinect, which was essentially a 3D camera that allowed gesture-based scamming, as well as controlling of the user interface. Again, by gestures and also by voice commands. Generally, the Kinect was kind of looked at as a bit of a novelty, with a few hit games, but not really widespread adoption, where everybody needed to have one. Still, it was neat. After the last two generations of the console wars revolved around proprietary hardware, the next generation would revolve around creating something that people could make stuff the absolute easiest and retain some degree of control over their intellectual property. Over the last two generations, Microsoft knew that people were using their consoles as media centers and really wanted to expand upon those features. In fact, they wanted to make the Xbox One the center of all of your living room entertainment, hence the name One rather than 720 or 1080 or some other multiple of 360. They wanted it to be the one device that you needed to do everything in the living room. And gamers, you know, their primary market, weren't that stoked about it. So in the year after announcement, Xbox spent a lot of time refocusing everything toward gaming. And obviously to handle that, you need some good hardware. Going back to the more simplified x86 architecture that the original Xbox used, who would have thought it would be that ahead of its time, that we would literally be back to that for both major named current consoles, with AMD manufacturing an APU rather than a CPU called Jaguar. Now an APU is a series of 64-bit microprocessors that AMD designed to act as both a CPU and a graphics accelerator chip. Now, being the system runs on an APU, the GPU is actually integrated and is based on the AMD GCN architecture with 12 units and has a total of 768 cores. It runs at 853 MHz and pretty much trounces the Xbox 360's graphics capabilities. Now, computer hardware is getting very different nowadays, and that reflects very much in the Xbox One's architecture. The Xbox One has 8 GB of RAM, which is essentially used for all functions, just like with the PlayStation 4 now. With all of this integrated technology, everything is kind of accessible by everything, which is great, by the way. The controller now connects using Bluetooth instead of a proprietary radio frequency, and also the hardware is pretty decently powerful on account, as of this very month, backward compatibility for Xbox 360 games is being rolled out. And that brings us to today. Who would have thought that a console four people made out of a few laptops would eventually become what we know today as one of the biggest brands in gaming? Xbox isn't just synonymous with a console, it's frankly synonymous with a culture. And though, as I said before, we never really saw a time where the Xbox was such a technologically primitive machine like the Nintendo Entertainment System, the amount we've seen the Xbox grow from the original console to the Xbox One is pretty amazing. amazing. Are you an Xbox One fan? Or maybe you're just interested in the evolution of console hardware? One way or another, leave us a comment, let us know what you thought of this video. Also, don't forget to click the like button, it helps us a great deal. If you haven't subscribed to gameranx, now would be a great time to do it because we upload new videos every single day, and the best way to see them first is a subscription. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video, and we will see you next time here on gameranx.